blue as I sing of a longing, blue as you. Weary day and lonely night seem to say that nothing's right. Everything is feeling blue. Here in my very soul I feel it too. Far in the distant hills I hear a cry. Then a silent hush and no reply. Prairie, won't you tell me true? Why have they spread this gloomy blanket of blue over you? Blue prairie, blue are the skies, blue are the sighs of a night wind calling. Blue prairie, blue are the hills.
This is a story of Western Kansas in the late 1860s as I remember it. It's a story of the vast prairie, the Indians we fought, but it's also much more than that. I mean, yes, it's a story of discovery and adventure, of the land and the secrets that it's held, the huge beast found in the middle of nowhere. But if the truth be told, it's the story of two men, two very different men, and the time they lived in. Now you may think it odd for someone who sounds like me to be telling you a story of the American frontier, but the West I knew was chock full of immigrants. Heck, even after 4 years of war against the South, there were still men in the army who could hardly speak any English. When my troop arrived at Fort Hays, Kansas in '66 and unloaded our gear and horses from the boxcars, my adventure begun in earnest. Out of the 20 men under me, 12 were what you would call Americans, and 4 of them were for the South. The rest were a bunch of heavily accented Europeans, Swedes, Germans, English. 20 men and me, an old sergeant from outside Edinburgh, Scotland. All with new shiny badges on our caps. I Troop, 7th US Cavalry. Hays was a busy town. It seemed that everyone was headed west. Kansas was such a new state then, you see, barely 10 years old. Kansas had suffered so much that we might secure the 34th star on that glorious flag, a truly free state at last. And we were ready to write the next chapter in its history. Since our destination lay on its route, we were assigned to escort the Butterfield Overland Dispatch stagecoach to Pond Creek Station, a stop on the trail to Denver. Fort Wallace, we were told, lay next to Pond Creek, 130 miles west of Hays. Pond Creek is a tributary of the Smoky, and it wouldn't impress folks back east much as a body of water. But the grass was thick around its banks, and there was a little grove of cottonwoods. The country rolled away towards the breaks. A mighty picturesque scene, if I do say so. Theodore Davis drew a picture for Harper's magazines and included high bluffs opposite the stage station. It was artistic license, I assure you. While there were plenty of bluffs along the Smoky, there were none here. It was pure propaganda to lure the settlers. The Butterfield Overland Dispatch was a big concern in those days. Every coach filled to capacity. They charged $175 for a week's bone-rattling passage from Atchison to Denver. This was not a trip for the poor. David Butterfield, the owner of the stage line, was an ambitious man and insisted the Army protect his investment. That made good sense, I reckon, since the Army was a big customer, moving troops and officers around. Even before Fort Wallace was established, a handful of men were stationed there at Camp Pond Creek. Now, the name Pond was confusing because there wasn't actually a pond there. It was named after Major James Burton Pond of the 3rd Wisconsin Cavalry. He'd been one of the escorts on the original survey of the Smoky Hill Trail, and it was his honour to be namesake of the camp and the creek. In 1866, just before I arrived, the name of Camp Pond Creek was changed to Fort Wallace, and that name was confusing too. Most folks naturally assumed it was for General Lew Wallace, who distinguished himself during the Great Rebellion and in leading the investigation into the conspiracy to kill President Lincoln. But no, the fort was named for Brigadier General William Harvey Lamb Wallace, martyred in the Battle of Shiloh. To confuse matters more, the fort was moved up the hill to higher ground a couple of miles east, and there it remained until 1882 when decommissioned by the War Department. As we rode past the men laying the new tracks, I knew I was at the very edge of civilization. I had never seen a more barren land in my life. Back then it was well named the Great American Desert. I admit to being mightily disappointed with my first glimpse of Fort Wallace. As we crested a slight rise, I could see 4 or 5 stone buildings standing by the side of a stream. 3 rows of weathered tents were pitched close by. It was hardly protected from the wind, never mind the Indians. A small cluster of 3 teepees stood to one side away from the rest. What bothered me most, however, was that I'd been briefed that 500 men were stationed at Fort Wallace, and lying before us were tents for 80. As we unsaddled and were greeted by the men of the fort, I didn't envy the rest of the journey for the stagecoach, another 200 miles to Denver and the mining camps beyond. With no room in the buildings for me or the lower ranks, I got assigned to an empty tent, and there were a few of those. It turns out that most of the men assigned to Fort Wallace were scattered along that road to Denver. 500 men patrolling 300 miles of open trail against many thousands of hostiles. My life changed that day. As the bugle announced day's end, I looked at the distant sunset. I knew only one obstacle stood in the way of conquering the continent. Somewhere out there in the dunes and rolling hills lay the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Sioux. The Plains tribes are confined to their reservations now, and although I see the point in doing so, I consider it somewhat of a pity, for once this land was theirs alone. But in the late 1860s, just 20 odd years ago, the world was a very different place. The plains of the Great American Desert were a battleground, as the buffalo was hunted to near extinction, and the tribes, dependent on the beast for thousands of years, faced privation and perhaps extinction themselves, and they didn't give up their land easily. There are some still alive like me who recall those turbulent times and the personalities who made it such a remarkable era. But I'll tell my story so you'll know of them. Know that they weren't made of bronze and marble, but of sinew and bone. Men possessed of great conceits, ambitions, men full of doubts and fears. They were as real as you and I assure you. As I speak, Bill Cody yet lives, taking his Wild West show to the far-flung parts of the world, but many of the heroes of the West are already gone. I outlived my friends Bill Comstock and poor Bill Hickok, their lives tragically cut short. Custer and Keogh, of course, died as heroes at Little Bighorn. Young Fred Beecher slain in '68 and his bones scattered to the winds. Kidder too, all taken from us. Even their foes are no more. Tall Bull and Roman Nose and so many of their brothers dwell in the spirit land. And yet those heroes are but bit actors in my story. The central figure was a young doctor newly posted to Fort Wallace, and over time he became a particular favourite of mine. Theophilus Turner was a sober-minded man, abstainer of drink, devoted to duty, and by all means quite capable at his trade. Having both survived the war, we swapped stories in the lonely evenings and became firm friends. Young Captain Turner, assigned as assistant surgeon, didn't lord over the men but spoke to us as equals, talking of his interest in guns, horses, in minerals and politics. He would shoot my Henry rifle and often remarked of his intent to buy one for himself. We were comfortable by the evening fires, not knowing we'd find ourselves in the midst of the most historic of events. Later, men lie comfortable in their beds, reading of these great exploits, and shake their heads in awe of the dangers and challenges of those distant days. But young Turner and their comrades lived them. The arrival of the mail was always a welcome time at the post, but no one was more excited than Dr. Turner. While many of us boys were looking for letters from wives or sweethearts, he awaited contact from his brothers. We knew his family was very close, for he spoke of them often. He was one of 9 children, and his father, George, I believe, was a successful merchant and landowner back in New Jersey. The name Theophilus, a source of endless teasing, came from his mother's father, Theophilus Hunt. And thus, the doctor was Theophilus Hunt Turner, a rather pretentious name for one we found so generous and down to earth. It proved a mouthful for his siblings too, and they simply called him Thof. He was especially close to his brothers nearest him in age, Edwin and Daniel, and there was a sister in there too, Leonora, I believe. He and Daniel corresponded faithfully, swapping letters each month or so.
Fort Wallace, Kansas, December 20th, 1867. Dear Brother, your last written after you reached home was duly received, but found things with us as monotonous as ever. The holidays have been interspersed with the coldest days of the season, and the greatest amount of snow, but that has not exceeded an inch or so. Christmas was passed pleasantly in due form. Good dinner, etc., was enjoyed with a relish only equaled by our longing for that which is civilized.
It seemed they were precocious children, with an educated mother and a stern yet indulgent father. Turner spoke lovingly and longingly of them all.
So now I have something very special for you. Theophilus, put your board down and come up and sit on my lap. Hold this up to your ear. Tell me what you hear. What do you hear?
The sea.
Do you hear the sea? As long as you hear the sea, you'll never be alone. Good job.
The doctor had come to age as our nation was reaching a great crisis, and it seemed for many years our young union might be torn apart over the abomination of slavery. Turner and I spoke of it at night occasionally, how the twists and turns of life take us in directions we would never have dreamed. He was a schoolboy when the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in '54, and settlers flocked to the Kansas Territory. I too had read the news of bloody Kansas, and we had no idea that we would someday experience our own version of the violence in the western reaches of the state. We also spoke of how fortunate we'd been having families who were literate, when so many others were not, as we had many more opportunities as a result. He spoke fondly of his teenage years at the Chester Institute, studying with the eminent scholar, William S. Rankin. He studied with Alexander Linville in Hackettstown, New Jersey, before venturing to New York City, where he enrolled in the College of Physicians and Surgeons. He then moved to Jefferson Medical College, still a prestigious college and nearer home. Turner's classmate was the artist Thomas Eakins, whose magnificent painting, The Gross Clinic, hearkened to the lectures and surgeries with the renowned physician and teacher Samuel Gross. I myself saw the artwork at the Centennial Exhibition in Philadelphia, displayed in the U.S. Army Post Hospital. People were horrified and inexplicably drawn to his work, and I searched the faces for young Turner, but couldn't decide if he was among them, though the artist had portrayed himself. There was no shortage of horror for the medical students in those days, the early years of the Great Rebellion. In the summer of '62, Turner was a medical cadet at Turner's Lane U.S. Army Hospital in Philadelphia. Turner graduated from Jefferson the following March and travelled to Washington City to sit the surgeon's exam in late April. He'd apparently been an outstanding student, and Dr. George McClellan, founder of the college and father of the famous general, wrote a letter of recommendation for a new physician. As a result, Turner was one of the first hires at the Fort Delaware Confederate prison on Pea Patch Island in the middle of the Delaware River. He began his duties in early May of '63, just in time for the disastrous Battle of Chancellorsville.
I think we might actually have you out of here today, heading back to the barracks.
Oh, that'd be mighty fine.
I think your fever's broke and you're looking pretty good. First, I need to get your name and your unit.
Isaac Henry Bowman, Company K, 50th Virginia.
50th Virginia?
Yes, sir.
Were you at Chancellorsville?
Sure was, Doc. We sure put a whooping on you Yanks up there.
I lost a lot of good friends up there.
So did I, Doc.
Turner served the remainder of the war under Crook's command, the Army of West Virginia, and was mustered out in October '65, having made it through the war unscathed, physically at least. I don't know why he re-enlisted. Maybe he just wanted to be his own man, but his father wasn't happy with the decision.
He could have had a comfortable practice right here.
Father.
He served his country, and unlike thousands of others, he survived. Where did he go to? Fort Wallace? Where is Fort Wallace? I can't even find it on a map.
My first recollection of our new commander was a year before, just after the war in Washington City, before I was assigned west. Captain Miles Keogh was in the reviewing stand with Hancock, Hooker, and perhaps Captain Tom Custer standing with him during the review of the Grand Army. He cut a dashing figure, and all the ladies flocked to him like flies to the proverbial honey. We envied him, we did, but we loved him, despite his being Irish Catholic. When Captain Keogh assumed command in November of '66, the stable of Fort Wallace still lacked a roof for want of nails. Nails, for goodness sake. His Irish temper flared at the thought of his horse suffering because some clerk had not shipped nails. Though, truth be told, his own situation was hardly better. The captain and some junior officers lived in tents that first winter. The army, in their typical bureaucratic fashion, had shipped stoves to heat the buildings, but no pipe to vent them, making them all but useless. But Keogh was resourceful and bright, and he cared about us men, and he cared about the fort. It was the only port he ever commanded, I believe. The combination of Keogh and Lieutenant Fred Beecher, who was post-quartermaster, was a fortuitous one for the fort. Keogh understood building. Beecher was masterful at acquiring the materials, and with a bit of our labour thrown in, a real fort began to take shape, although it never had walls like the forts in the war. Stone was readily available, and we quarried it nearby. Timber was way more expensive, hauled from the forests of Colorado and brought by wagon along the tenuous and dangerous trail. In the time I was there, the educated Keogh had a reading room and a library added to the post school. He organised a glee club and a band to occupy and edify the men, and we needed something, because boredom was a constant companion. More than once the commander ordered the post sutler to halt the sale of intoxicating liquors because the men had gotten out of hand. The chief of scouts at Fort Wallace, and the other integral character in our story, was 26-year-old William Comstock. The class of men who found employment as scouts at these frontier posts was composed of colourful personalities, and our Bill Comstock was no exception. Nicknamed Medicine Bill, it was said he was part Indian, or that he'd been kidnapped as a babe and raised by the Cheyenne. He let us believe the tales, for they added to his mystique. He often dressed in buckskins and wore moccasins after the fashion of the natives. His hair was long, and he spoke in the vernacular of the untutored plainsman, although I later found out he was the son of a Michigan lawyer and the grandnephew of the great American novelist, James Fenimore Cooper. In fact, it was as if the leather-stocking tales were the script for Comstock's life. Comstock seemed at first like an unlikely companion for Dr. Turner, but the two quickly struck up a friendship. His experience with the Plains tribes was considerable. He'd been an Indian trader in the Nebraska Territory and shown shrewd business sense when yet in his teens. He found the Rose Creek Ranch near the newly established Fort Wallace and commenced filling a lucrative contract, providing hay to the post. He soon found himself in the post's employ. Now, I hope you understand how valuable he was. Paid $100 a month or more, his salary was 10 times that of most enlisted men. But he was worth that, and then some. Comstock was a man of average stature, but there was nothing else normal about him. He had grand blue eyes that seemed to flash all around you, a feature irresistible to the ladies, but men could not help noticing too. His gaze was unflinching, and my old acquaintance William Webb said it so well when he told of first seeing Comstock at Pond Creek Station. As Webb described, Comstock's gaze was not altogether a comfortable experience. A wiry, sinewy man, he was ideally suited to be chief of scouts. He knew the land intimately, the migration patterns of the bison. He knew the natives, their languages and habits, and was perfectly at home with them. He earned the admiration of those who knew him. His skills were highly valued. General Custer said of him, "No Indian knew the country more thoroughly than did Comstock. He was perfectly familiar with every divide, watercourse, and strip of timber for hundreds of miles in either direction. He knew the dress and peculiarities of every Indian tribe and spoke the language of many of them." You know, to the Indians, medicine meant magic or power. This is what Bill's name meant, that he had a very special medicine. He feigned, I think, superstitious ways to better fit in with the Indians and to further his being identified as one. Certainly his raven hair convinced Webb of Indian blood, and his curious ways confirmed it. He was never a crude man, but he had that rare ability to walk in two worlds, equally at ease in both. Bill Cody was like that too. He could forage for his supper one night and sit to tea with the Queen the next. Well, sir, both these Bills had quite the reputation as hunters. One day, as a herd of buffalo were passing through, to break the boredom, the officers of both forts organized a shooting match. It was a party. There was champagne, oysters, and spectators gathered west on the monument to watch the two men riding through the herd on horseback. At day's end, Cody had killed more and earned the sobriquet of Buffalo Bill. If the loss troubled Comstock, he never spoke of it. More likely, he never gave it any thought. To the scouts, it had been a lark, a friendly competition, and these two men were far too busy living to reflect further. Knowing Turner's curiosity, it's likely it was Comstock who led Turner to the area where fossils could be found. To augment our quite meagre rations, they often left the confines of the fort and hunted antelope and deer. Turner used these hunting trips to foster his keen interest in geology of the barren landscape. Those of us left behind envied the officers and the scouts the ability to leave the post at will, most of the time using hunting as the excuse. Oh, they returned with venison, an antelope now and then, a buffalo when the herds were passing by, but we knew it was mostly an excuse to leave the confines of our military-structured civilization, our routine of boredom and enforced busy work. I'm quite sure Comstock did most of the hunting, of course, although Turner was a fair shot himself and enjoyed riding. Over the course of '67, fossil finds became common. Shells and single bones, sharp teeth and skulls from animals long extinct. These bones provided much conversation over the evening drinks and tobacco. One evening, however, on their return, Turner leapt off his gold mare, obviously excited. Comstock had an antelope over the front of his saddle, but all Turner could talk about was the beast. He described it as a dragon, a whole array of bones jutting from the black hillside of an area called Twin Buttes, just like the animal had laid down and died a few months ago, except, of course, it was embedded into the side of a ravine, 20 feet deep. I was with them on the return trip, half a day's ride to the north of the fort, and chosen to stand guard as Turner and some of the men hacked at the rock wall. In just an hour or so's work, they'd exposed much more of the creature he now hoped was complete.
On Friday last, a party of us started on the prairie, ostensibly for the purpose of hunting, but in reality for the purpose of procuring the skeleton of an extinct monster, which is embedded some 14 miles north of here. It was found to rest in a slate hill similar in appearance to those which are found on the road between Home and Newton. We did a considerable amount of digging, but the majority of us, being constitutionally opposed to hard work, concluded at some future day to secure reinforcements and renew our efforts in that direction.
Winter was just coming to the plain in fits and starts, dry gales one day and blowing snow the next. The work was hard, and although we all offered to abandon our sentry positions and help, Turner bade half of us watch the horizons, while the others chipped at the wall with axes and chisels. As I scanned the deserted horizon, I could hear him entreat the men working on the beast to take care and not hit the actual bones. Even from those first days, he sensed the significance of such a find.
If as valuable as it appears, it will be forwarded to some Eastern scientific institution. At any rate, I will inform you of the results. For the present, good night. Write me upon your return to Princeton. As ever, Thof.
The area where Twin Buttes lay had been a landmark to the native tribes for hundreds of years. The Cheyenne said that the peaks had evil spirits, that it was dangerous to go there. I'm not a superstitious man, but there may have been some truth in their warning, for within 2 years of finding the beast, Dr. Theophilus Turner and Scout Bill Comstock were both dead. I have recollections from many visits to the site. I thought it no wonder that the Cheyenne believed the place to be haunted. Twin Buttes is a quiet, heartless place of desolate, dark ground, full of slate, shale, and odd crystals which I cannot name. Looking back, that unworldly ravine is just the sort of place, I suppose, where one would expect to find the bones of an extinct sea critter cast ashore in our huge desert. We pulled 3 huge vertebrae onto the wagon that afternoon, 3 bones to be taken back to the fort for further examination. Turner wrote to a professor in Philadelphia, giving him detailed dimensions and drawings of the bones, but getting the critter out wasn't going to be that easy.
Dear brother, I assure you with truth that I would have been horrified at your state had known what my confounded serpent was. I wrote about it to Cope, curator of Academy Natural Sciences at Philadelphia, giving about the same account I gave you. Was sure, however, not to disappoint when he should receive it.
Thy account interests me much, and thy discoveries will no doubt furnish another valuable page for the book of nature, and a source of instruction in science. The fragments I have seen indicate a form allied to Plesiosaurus, but for its explanation we must await the arrival of the specimens.
He wished me to express it through from West, a procedure which would cost about $150. To save the institution expense, I shall keep it for 2 or 3 days and forward by government train to the railroad, which is about 100 miles. By express it would cost about 12 cents per pound, and the critter weighs near half a ton. Goodbye, as ever, Thof.
That same spring of '67, Winfield Scott Hancock, Hancock the Superb, who had performed so admirably in the late rebellion, took to the plains and launched a campaign against the Cheyenne. Custer messaged Captain Keogh and requested Comstock services. Keogh complied, of course, but also said Comstock was too valuable to Fort Wallace to be away very long. We watched and waved goodbye as Comstock climbed aboard the stagecoach, headed for the end of the tracks, to board the train for the rest of the trip. In our eyes, Hancock's campaign was a fiasco, riling the natives unnecessarily, but it sure curtailed any non-essential excursions for poor Dr. Turner. I could see the tension in his body just waiting for release. Comstock's departure put the seal on it. There would be no more visits to his dragon for some time.
My esteemed friend, Dr. Turner, I have had the pleasure of reading thy last in the reference to further explorations in the neighborhood of Fort Wallace. It is a matter of regret that the Indian disturbance render it unsafe to pursue investigation in the beds of the region, but no doubt the time will come ere long when such examinations can be readily made. I remain as ever thy friend, Edward D. Cope.
We joked at Hancock's efforts. There was a feeling of superiority over the natives, although most of us were new to the post and had never engaged any. We were veterans. We had fought a 4-year war. We had better weapons. One cavalry soldier's worth 10 Indians, we remarked often. Oh, how quickly we'd learned to regret such overconfidence. Near the end of June, Captain Albert Barnett's with G Company of the 7th were guiding a railroad survey party and were encamped near the fort. On their arrival, they introduced an Eastern visitor for Dr. Turner. It was the misfortune of Dr. John LeConte to arrive when he did. He was immediately given a harsh baptism of frontier life. For the next day, when the Cheyenne attacked, it took us all by complete surprise. Captain Keogh was away from the fort at the time, and Hale was in command, rousing us and bidding the bugler to call everyone to arms. Barnett's and G Company arrived quickly, almost doubling our number to nearly 50, as over 300 Cheyenne rode slowly towards the creek. For a moment, knowing we were horribly outnumbered, I considered the possibility of a peaceful outcome. Then they charged. They swept into our parade ground like a whirlwind, screeching and shooting. I'd never seen anything like it and don't wish to ever see it again. Men fell all around me. Sergeant Williams was grabbed from his position, murdered, stripped and mutilated in the time it took the Indian horses to turn. For 3 hours we fought as if the hounds of hell were coming against us. It was the only time in the West that I ran out of ammunition, and in the lulls between charges, Quartermaster Lieutenant Beecher ran from building to building with boxes of shells. When the Indians finally retreated, we sat around exhausted, too tired to even stand guard properly. Thank God the natives never returned, for we were in no state to deal with further attacks. To my knowledge, the adage about 1 soldier equaling 10 natives was never spoken again. As fate would have it, there was a photographer present, William Bell, who was with the survey party. As we rested, he busied himself with his camera, and I recall his composure, remembering the screams and cacophony of the last hours. I look back now at that photo of Barnett's and the other officers just after the fight, and they look as perfectly relaxed as if they were going to have tea. No one would imagine from looking into their faces the scene they had just witnessed. There was a photo of the mutilated body of Sergeant Williams too, and many of us thought it in poor taste. God rest his soul. I shall never forget it. He was an Englishman, and we'd often debated, but nonetheless I wished him no such horrible end. We buried him and the others, and then it was business on the fort as usual, for that was the way of life in the West. In the end, we lost 7 men, with many more in the hospital under a now very busy Dr. Turner. Because of the new hostilities, we could not take Dr. LeConte to the Buttes to see the beast for himself. However, having spent the battle holed up in the fort hospital, He was very content to stay inside the fort and listen to every one of our testimonies of the beast's bones on the rock wall. He ran his fingers over the surface of the 3 backbones we already had, marvelling at their size and condition. If we could get the beast out of the ground, he declared loudly, it might be the talk of the world. A week later, Comstock was with Custer when they discovered the mutilated bodies of Lieutenant Lyman Kidder and his command. Such a sad, sad loss. Just one more tragedy in the Plains Indian Wars. As the scout looked down on the corpses, could he imagine that in such a short while he too would lie under the unforgiving sun? Once the hostilities had died down, the doctor asked me to draft a handful of men to go back to the buttes to retrieve more of the beast. Comstock led the party, and once we'd arrived, we still posted a few guards, just in case the Cheyenne found our presence more disturbing than the spirits who haunted the land. But most of us dug at the rock. We thought it quite the lark, really, and were glad to be included at the grand unearthing of our very own dragon. In the evening, we sat in our camp and speculated about the nature of our beast and the times in which it had lived. Turner described how the very country where we sat had been an ocean, a vast sea. Some of the boys looked around at the windswept dusty ground and laughed out loud. We looked to Comstock, knowing he would think the entire idea absurd, but to my surprise he did not. Instead, he pulled a book from his saddlebag and read us an excerpt from a worn volume. It was a book called The Prairie, and it was written by James Fenimore Cooper. Well, now, of course, I realise that was his uncle, but I surely did not know that at the time. I have never forgotten the passage he read to us that day. The earth was not unlike the ocean, when its restless waters are heaving heavily, after the agitation and fury of the tempest have begun to lessen. There was the same waving and regular surface, the same absence of foreign objects, and the same boundless extent to the view. As I watched nightfall on the unbroken prairie, turning its warm colours to blue, it was not so difficult to imagine the heaving waters with our beast rising to the surface. As the wolves and coyotes howled amongst us, it was not so hard to imagine the roar of our dragon echoing across the ripples just before he dove back under the water to snatch its prey. In the cold winds of the winter of '67, over many visits to the site, we unveiled the whole structure from head to tail. Dr. Turner took particular attention to the creature's head, which measured almost 4 feet in length. Many of the teeth were broken, but some sharp pieces were 6 inches long and still in place in the creature's huge jaw, giving me terrible dreams. The body of the beast, to my mind, seemed like a squashed elephant. Under Dr. Turner's direction, to keep the bones together, we uncovered the beast one small section at a time, 5 or 6 men working on one small part of the rock as others shoveled away the debris below. Once each load was ready for transportation, Dr. Turner would saddle up and reluctantly leave the ravine. He worried incessantly of the Indians sabotaging his find once we had left. Once the hole in the side of the ravine was empty of bones, Turner's visits to the area decreased. Back in the fort, he toiled on the bones at every opportunity, drawing pictures and ensuring no damage had occurred on the terribly rough journeys back to the fort. After checking each one, we packed the bones again, using more hessian in the boxes for the railroad. Back at the buttes, Dr. Turner looked for more complete structures, but failed to do so, although he did collect individual bones by the 100. With his life cut so cruelly short, the beast of Twin Buttes would be his only discovery. Thof's dragon. Comstock and Turner were fast friends until Comstock committed murder. The victim was a man named Wyatt. Wyatt was an unpleasant man, and may have ridden with Quantrill and his guerrillas when Lawrence was laid waste in 1863. Perhaps hearing this detail inflamed Comstock, for we would like to believe he wouldn't really have murdered a man simply for swindling him in a business deal. Reliable witnesses said Comstock shot Wyatt in the back. Even in this wild frontier, such a thing was unconscionable. Taken to trial in Hayes, the judge dismissed the charges, citing a lack of evidence of motive or unlawful intent. Many folks thought this was evidence of his popularity and not his guilt. To the mind and heart of a Dr. Turner, it was simply unthinkable. Comstock's death was as controversial as his life. Nothing was straightforward, not even his grave. It remains unmarked, unmourned. Comstock and a fellow scout, Abner Sharp Grover, were dispatched to treat with Chief Turkey Leg of the Cheyenne. The meeting was cordial according to Indian accounts, and the scouts were escorted safely to and from the camp. Grover told another story when he returned to the post alone. He said that as they were leaving, the braves shot both men, Comstock mortally. Grover somehow escaped, a fact that many found incredulous, especially Reuben Waller, a soldier in the 10th U.S. Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, stationed at Fort Wallace. Waller was one of the soldiers who rode back with Grover to the scene of the attack. He noted the only horse tracks were those of the two scouts. He believed that Rover had killed Comstock. Waller spit every time he said Grover's name. And soon Grover had the Rose Creek ranch that once belonged to Comstock. Turner said, "No man's loss could have affected the fort more than Comstock's." In the summer of '67, when the cavalry was camped near the fort that summer, cholera swept through the men. The cemetery seemed the busiest part of the post, and the burial details grew weary, digging graves at night to avoid the heat. It was my good friend Dr. Turner, I assure you, that kept the cholera's ravages from the post itself with his strict regimen, but all the same we were sorely afraid. I don't know what we feared most, the Indian raids or the sickness. In the spring of '68, Dr. Turner took leave and returned home to New Jersey, staying about a month. He visited Philadelphia to see his dragon, but Dr. Cope was not in residence. But when he returned, I could see something had changed in him. He seemed satisfied to be in the West, finally at ease. Then came 1868 and Lieutenant Beecher's death. In the August of that year, we received news that a war party of Cheyenne, Arapaho and Sioux had raided along the Saline and Solomon rivers, killing 13 and taking one poor woman captive. There was a public outcry, and the reactions were swift and furious.
Fort Dodge, Kansas, June 7th, 1868. Dear Turner, I am as busy as can be. Have seen lots of Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Kiowas. Tomorrow I am going into their camps and may be away from the Smoky several days. If you can tell Comstock to send any important news he may get to General Sheridan direct until the 13th, when I will return to Hayes. I suppose Keogh has taken his departure and is jolly. Dr. DeGraw sends love, and so do all that know you. I shall see Wallace again, and before the month passes, I hope. My love to Wigan. I wish to embrace him with shoulder straps on. Yours, etc., Beecher.
Little Phil, General Sheridan, had had enough as well. He authorized the recruitment of elite scouts who would find the Indians so they could be punished. I knew some of those that had signed on, and I had seen Major George Forsyth during the late war. The story of the Forsyth Scouts is widely known, and I will not repeat it here except to add a few comments. I was in the Fort Wallace sutler store when the stage from Cheyenne Wells brought Scouts, Jack Stillwell, and Frenchy Trudeau. A commotion rose when the stage arrived with his pitiful men. Their words tumbled out in a barrage like the bullets from a Gatling gun. The stage driver was talking too, telling us how he'd found them, their feet swollen and full of stickers, barely able to walk. It turns out Forsyth's men had been pinned down on an island in the Arikari River more than a week ago. They had been eating rotting horse and mule flesh to survive. Beecher was dead, Forsyth wounded. The tale was too awful to believe, and yet here were those ragged, brave lads as proof. Dr. Turner was to go with the relief effort. Though the word of the death of his friend Beecher touched him deeply, he was eager to do his part to help the suffering of those who'd been wounded. Colonel Carpenter, with 2 companies of the 10th U.S. Colored Troops, arrived first at the battleground, though they could smell it long before they reached it. The Buffalo Soldiers, what the Indians called our black troops, immediately made a camp upwind from the rotting horses and humans, and began tending the wounded and burying the dead as respectfully as practical. We heard bits and pieces from each man. More of the tragic story unfolded. They believed that the Cheyenne warrior Roman Nose had been killed. I guess he wasn't immortal after all, as some believed. Sharp Grover led a detail that December, and I went along with Dr. Turner to bring back the remains of these men for proper burial in the post cemetery. Turner had been corresponding with Lieutenant Beecher's father and had shipped his belongings home. It was a great weight upon him, his friend's death. Whether it was animals or Indians to blame, only 2 of the 5 bodies were discovered. It distressed Turner greatly when the remains of Lieutenant Beecher were gone. In the summer of '69, word reached us of Colonel Carr's 5th Cavalry battle at Summit Springs in the Colorado Territory. Only days later, Dr. Turner took ill. We thought little of it when Dr. Shearer insisted Turner take to bed, but after a couple of days, his condition worsened. He just didn't have the strength to even put pen to paper, not even a letter to his brothers. I watched him slowly fade away from us. Theophilus Turner died on July 27, 1869, and I do not know a man at the fort or even heard the news who didn't mourn.
We all sympathize with you and your afflicted family, sir, in this, your sudden and terrible loss and profound grief. For we too had learned to love the deceased for his many good qualities of heart as well as of mind. Still, we are overwhelmed with sorrow at the sundering of the warm social ties that bound us to him.
In his many letters, he wrote of an important discovery he made on the plains of Kansas. However, he was never recognized for his tremendous contribution. He wrote of his adventures in those letters, and now I cling to those last words.
Later, Dr. Turner's father wished for his son to be returned to home, to rest with his family. So in February, with just as much care as we'd taken laying him to rest, we dug him up again. We sent him home on the train. I left the army soon after Turner died. My heart just wasn't in it anymore. Last year, I ventured to the western reaches of our state once again to attend the wedding of my friend, Fenton Pratt. Then I went to Fort Wallace. And then I rented a horse from the livery and rode out to the old fort site. The buildings were gone, lumber and stone made into barns and farmhouses. The foundations remained in broken bottles and here and there an insignia. Company I, 7th Cavalry, Company H, 10th Cavalry, and I wondered at the trooper's consternation when he returned to his quarters only to find his hat was bare. I walked over to the old post cemetery. The army moved most of the graves to Fort Leavenworth a couple of years ago, but there are boards to mark the resting places of civilians, some killed in accidents, some from disease, some shot down amid the lawlessness of the days. Scouts Grover and O'Donnell remain here, unbothered, and I could not help but think Grover was never bothered much in life either. I looked to the empty spot where we had buried Dr. Turner and then disinterred him months later. I know others see emptiness here, but for those of us who lived those days, the very dirt here is precious, made more so by the dust of those brave men long gone. Back home in Philadelphia, the beast we dug from that ravine wall hangs above the heads of the folks walking through the Philadelphia Museum. I go there every time I'm in town and look up at it like Turner never got to do, and remember digging and packing every one of those bones. I even stand to the side as kids marvel the dragon we uncovered. Some draw pictures while men set up their cameras. There's even plans to make molds of every bone and ship copies to New York and to museums overseas. It sure has become the talk of the world after all, just like that professor said it would. Me? I still remember it sticking out of the rock on them cold, desolate days, and poor Dr. Turner chipping carefully away while Comstock stood on the rise, looking off to the west. That's the picture I remember.
The light flickers from the candle, cuts the night so I can read how a one-horse town put a spell on you. Dear brother, out west is where I'll be. Ooh, still to rust, water to dust, an ocean turned to prairie. And though times are tough, I'm discovering so much. Dear brother, from me devotedly. In game on an eastbound train, best regards and your empty pair of boots. Parcels like pages from the past. Dear brother, lay your pen down and rest. Dear brother, in the soul of the West. Ooh, still to rust, water to dust, an ocean turned to prairie. Though times are tough, I'm discovering so much. Dear brother, from me devotedly. Dear brother, from me devotedly. The light flickers from the candle. Family in tow, wagon wheels all in a row. Go out west with me, sweet Emily. Follow the dirt path to the next stop on the map. Go out west with me, sweet Emily. Out west, where they're giving land for free. All it takes is planting some seeds. Well, I search for shady trees, riverbeds where we can drink. Go out west. sweet Emily. Someday we shall find a place that's mighty fine. Go out west with me, sweet Emily. Out west, where they're giving land for free. All it takes is planting some seeds where the water didn't flow and the crops they didn't grow. Out west with me, my sweet Emily, with a house made up of mud, with rattlesnakes and flash floods.